probably the biggest and most important realization, which a lot of people don't think about, is like in New South Wales, and I'm pretty sure most other states, it's like you pay the bond to basically a trustee, which in the case of New South Wales is the government. You don't pay it to the real estate. So the real estate don't have your money. It's like the most important thing to understand. They literally don't have the bond. And then importantly, after that, your bond goes back to you unless the real estate takes proactive steps to challenge that. So what that means is if your lease ends and no one has anything to say about it, everyone just you don't ask for your bond back, the real estate doesn't say that they, need your bond back, then in the case of New South Wales, Department of Fair Trading will actually just send you the money back with no action. The Aussie Fire podcast is a collaboration between Strong Money Australia and Pearler, Australia's favourite boring long-term investing platform. Join our hosts, Dave from Strong Money Australia and Hayden from Pearler, as they discuss all things financial independence. At Aussie Fire, we're big fans of sharing experiences and talking about money. However, please note that any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives. Consider whether it's appropriate for you, and if in doubt, speak to a licensed financial advisor.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Aussie Fire podcast. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. We've actually got Hayden, who's going to be speaking about the 10 lessons that he's learned from his years of renting. And I think it's been more than a decade that Hayden has rented for in the past. And obviously we've both rented over the years, but Hayden's had a much more varied and I would say a deeper experience than I have. And he's dealt with things that I didn't have to deal with. So it's actually going to be quite interesting to unpack what he's learned over the years and the tips that he has for people who are renting and some things that you might not be aware of.
Looking forward to it, Dave. I think before we jump into it too much, how much have you rented?
I rented for a period of probably, about 2.5 to 3 years when I was 18, and then lived in an own-occupied home after that for about 6 or 7 years, and then rented again after that for another 4 years, I think, and now in own-occupied home again for 3 years. So I've rented for, a good 6, 7, 8 years overall.
Yeah, cool. Awesome.
All right. So I'm going to guess straight away that the tips that you might have are going to be specific to your situation, which was obviously based in New South Wales. So if people are listening and they're like, I'm not quite sure if that applies in my state, you very well might be right, because the tenancy laws specifically do vary a little bit by state. So hopefully you can just pick up, the general themes of what's being said here. I'm sure that's the case. Is that right, Hayden?
Yeah, some states are nicer, some states are less nice. Some of them will have different rules around. I think Victoria's tried to pioneer a bunch of pro-renter stuff compared to other states. So definitely check your state website, because obviously all of my experience has been pretty heavily based in New South Wales.
And just to unpack these things right from the start, do you want to actually walk us through the context here? Before you give us the tips, what's your renting history or renting experience been over the years? Yeah,
so it was basically, I did 2 years at a residential college at a university. I did 1 year in kind of an apartment that was nearish university. Then I did, in between that, I did 2 lots of 3 months in a share house, different types of share houses. Then I went and signed a lease for a house with a bunch of friends in Mascot in Sydney. And then I signed another lease in Mascot in Sydney. And then I crashed at a friend's place for a year and kind of rented off them. And then I went and rented a room kind of in central Sydney off a family for a year and a half. And then I went and signed another short-term lease for a room, and then another lease for an apartment that was the whole apartment, and then another lease for a whole apartment. That's the condensed version of it all.
Yeah, wow. That's quite a lot of... See, that's what I mean. You've had a lot of varied experience. I just lived in a share house once and then a full rental once. Yeah.
It's been 5 proper full house or apartment rentals, and then a whole bunch of kind of subletting, and then some oddball experiences outside of that.
Sure. Actually, I want to ask you a question just before we kick things off. How did you find the whole subletting situation versus renting a room or renting a house by yourself? Obviously, there's pros and cons there, but was it dramatically different in terms of, lifestyle and, let's say, enjoyment of that experience?
Look, it's a mixed bag. What I'd say is probably my favorite place I've ever lived was for a year and a half in a family's spare bedroom. They basically had like a 2-year-old, and they were trying to fill a room to make some money, and I basically lived in the room. And it was great because it was kind of like you had your own rental in a sense, like you had your own room, and there was just like a lot of mess in the house, which might sound like a negative thing to some people, but I really liked it because I didn't have to worry too much. Like, as a really simple, very lazy example, when you're living with like a family with a young baby, I never had to take the rubbish out because like the amount I would like contribute to the rubbish in the kitchen was always like so small, compared to just like the mess of the household. So it was a lovely like year and a half where there were just a few things that I didn't have to worry about from like a life admin perspective because the family had like to deal with most of it, Like the baby would just crap on, not like, actually crap, but like leave crap on the floor. So if I dropped a crumb while I was making bread or something, it didn't matter because it all get vacuumed up twice a day.
Interesting. So you weren't doing the whole Simpsons thing, where they start stapling stuff to the bin so they don't have to take it out?
Oh, I've been in all kinds of scenarios. Like just before we get into it, at one point I lived in a share house, and the way we did chores was that we actually did an auction for chores. So we wrote out all the chores and we came together once a month for the next month, say the month of March. And we would say something like clean the oven, and we would basically bid down. So someone would be like, I do it for $50. And then someone else would be like, I do it for $40. And someone else would be like, no, I'll do it for $30. And you basically use the market to figure out who actually wants to do the chores. And then you would net out the cost at the end. So you would just sum up what everyone gets paid. And then you'd basically have like a balance at that month. And every month you might be busier. So you might want to do less or do more. And it'd just be like, here's your chores for the month. You have to pay $25, or here's your chores for the month. You get $40 from the house. So lots of different experiences.
That's actually an awesome idea. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it worked really well. It worked flawlessly. I would recommend it for anyone who's struggling with that. Money schemers help resolve a lot of problems.
Market-based chores.
Exactly.
God damn. All right. So do you want to walk us through a few of these tips then that you've learned over the years, mate?
Yeah, probably the biggest or the first one was just like you don't have to leave a place spotlessly clean when you move out. I think it's something that really annoyed me with a lot of real estates was they'd always say, oh, you've got to clean this, or you've got to get steam cleaning or all kinds of stuff. But if you actually read the tenancy agreement in New South Wales, it does pretty clearly say that you're required to leave the property in the same state when you found it. And this is definitely the case for a lot of Sydney-based properties, is that they're often left in a shamble when you move in. Like most leases I've moved into, there has been like copious amounts of dust everywhere. Like you'll find a couple of dead cockroaches somewhere. They'll like have never cleaned under the dishwasher in the kitchen or like whatever it is. So the windows will all be dirty, and the reason for that is because in hot property markets, a lot of the time, why would the real estate care? Someone's going to sign the lease anyway, so they'll just sign it as it is. But yeah, I hated this because real estates will basically use you cleaning at the end to make the next tenant happy. So rather than have to worry about the next tenant complaining, they're like, I'll just get free labor from the existing tenant, even though they moved in when it was kind of a crap hole. And they'll often do things like try and threaten you and say, oh, we're going to take your bond or something like this. And yeah, it really drives me crazy because it is just kind of a manipulative form of trying to get some free labor.
That's quite an interesting one because we actually experienced this on our last rental. So when we moved into, this is probably one of your tips, but when we moved into the rental, as you said, it was quite dusty. The windows were a bit dirty, blah, blah, blah. So we noted all these things down, when they give you that inspection, that basically a condition report, and you say, basically, do you agree to this? So then there's a spot for you to put all your notes. So we put in all these notes. And then when you move out of the home, then they're like, okay, it has to be back to the standard that it was, which is fine. And because we had all these notes, luckily we're like, well, this was the condition that it was in. So it doesn't have to obviously be perfect when we leave. So that's one way you can protect yourself against that kind of a risk. Because otherwise they'll be like, well, this isn't clean. So you need some sort of proof that's like, well, it wasn't clean before. So it's actually the same standard that we've kept.
Yeah, and that was actually one of my second tips was around taking high quality photos of stuff, which ties pretty much directly into that, which is, look, the inspection sheets are great. Like it's great that you filled that in, but I find them a little bit time consuming and I'm not sure what to write sometimes or whatever else. So usually what I do when I go into a lease is I just take like really close, high, like quality photos with my phone of every single little problem. You'll find like 100 and it takes like 10 minutes, right? You just walk around, snap, 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 snap. You just like zip them up or put them in a Google Drive or attach them to an email, basically send that to the real estate. And I love it for a couple of reasons. Is like one is photos are really hard to argue with a lot of the time because like you know, you don't get into debates about, oh, you know, what's the case with, and you said the door was damaged, but I think it's more damaged than this. But the other part is, I think it really, in my experience, intimidates the real estate when they get like a couple hundred photos, you know, megabytes worth of photos of like, and then they open one of them and they see like a really zoomed in, and use the flash. Flash always makes things look worse. You know, and they like see it, and you could like, I mean, I might be reading between the lines, but I think it does kind of communicate very early on that you're paying attention, which is pretty important as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I suppose related to the cleaning is, you know, when you're leaving the property and like you said, they'll try and say, hey, it's not clean, so we're going to actually keep some of your bond to pay for the cleaning fees to get it back to the standard that it's supposed to be in. So how do we deal with these sorts of things where they're going to try and essentially take some of your bond to improve the property beyond that sort of a thing? Like what have you found out about protecting yourself when it comes to maximizing your bond return, let's say?
Yeah, for sure. So this one for me is like rooted in some pain, which is the very first rental we had. The toilet like cistern just exploded on our last week we were there randomly. We were like sitting in the living room. We just had like a bang. And, you know, we told the real estate and they basically emailed us and were like, you need to fix that. If you don't fix it, we're going to take your bond, is like the really short story. And we were 20 years old. We were all kind of panicked, you know, not sure what to do and not sure what if they try and keep, like we just didn't know. So we just paid to fix the toilet. We paid like $400 or something to fix this toilet. And that kind of spawned on a lot of frustration in me when it comes to the bond topic. And probably the biggest and most important realization, which a lot of people don't think about, is like in New South Wales, and I'm pretty sure most other states, it's like you pay the bond to basically a trustee, which in the case of New South Wales is the government. You don't pay it to the real estate. So the real estate don't have your money. It's like the most important thing to understand. They literally don't have the bond. And then importantly, after that, your bond goes back to you unless the real estate takes proactive steps to challenge that. So what that means is if your lease ends and no one has anything to say about it, everyone like just, you don't ask for your bond back, the real estate doesn't say that they, you know, need your bond back, then in the case of New South Wales, Department of Fair Trading will actually just send you the money back with like no action. And this is really important because like the real estate has to basically apply to get your bond back, which means they then have to probably take you to a tribunal through NCAT. This thing takes time. This takes energy. Like these real estates are not going to do this for free, firstly, right? They're not just going to do it out of the kindness of their heart. Like I haven't been a landlord in this context, but I'm sure, you know, maybe some real estates will have some sort of retainer element, but they're not going to go and spend 2 or 3 hours dealing with, you know, a tribunal stuff without talking to the landlord in some cases, or probably many cases without trying to, you know, seek some kind of payment for it because it's still their time at the end of the day. So like the odds that they're going to try and actually follow you up about something that's worth a couple $100 that they're being extortionary about is like really, really low. So, you know, a good example was my last tenancy when I moved in, the oven handle knobs that you turn the oven off just like broke on the first day. And I never told the real estate about it because I just forgot about it. And it's like, well, when I move into this place, when I move out of this place, if the real estate's like, oh, we're going to have to replace the oven now, it's like a $300 oven, like they have to take steps, spend money or spend the landlord's money and then still turn up to a tribunal at some point and prove that you're wrong. And that's a big hurdle. Like it's a big hurdle for them to do that. It's often not worth their time. So it's often smoke and mirrors to try and scare you into being like, oh no, I don't want them to steal my money. And I hate that because I see this happen all the time, particularly with cleaning is like where they get it. It's always like, oh, we'll have to bring in professional cleaners and take it out of your bond. And it's just, yeah, they're bluffing about how easily they can do that is the short story.
Yeah, that's definitely worth remembering. I also think that part of it is not necessarily coming from a place of nastiness. I think honestly, a lot of it is coming from a place of laziness because as a landlord, I've kind of experienced this sort of thing as well, where the manager will go and do their final inspection and then they'll come back and say, hey, this is the condition of the property, blah, blah, blah. And then obviously they put that to the tenant and say, hey, it's not quite up to standard. You need to either fix this yourself by, you know, doing extra cleaning, or if you don't want to do it, then we'll take some of your bond money to do that cleaning on your behalf. But I think what happens is the landlord's not really involved until the end, until there's like a problem with that sort of thing. So quite often if the tenant then pushes back and is like what we were saying earlier, no, wait a minute, this property is actually in a very similar condition to when we got it. So you need to go back and look at the initial inspection, and actually you can verify it from those, like either the notes that we took or the photos that I sent or anything like that. And then you can compare those two and see that we're telling the truth, that it's basically not neglect or it's not, a poor quality of cleaning that we've done. Because then what happens is, because of that pushback, then it becomes more fair for them to be like, to go to that landlord at that point and say, hey, we found the property in this condition. We're saying this. The tenant is saying this. So what would you like to do? And quite often, I've had this recently actually, if what the tenant is saying is reasonable, then the landlord will have no real issue with like siding with the tenant or finding some sort of a happy middle ground. Because like you said, it's going to be extra hassle and extra cost to try and fight it. So it's not really worth it. So as long as, I would say most people are being reasonable most of the time. So I think that quite a few of these incidents with property managers, probably just them being lazy and just thinking, well, it has to be clean to a certain standard. And so they're just noting these things on the final inspection without necessarily going back to look at the detailed report that was initially done and any sort of tenant comments and things like that.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. And I think the laziness part for me is a really big deal and a really important thing to point out. Because as an example, I've had tenancies where the real estate will just forget to come do their inspections. And then when I move out, they'll kind of clearly see stuff that they were like, oh, we have a problem with that. And then they'll use that because they like, I'm assuming they don't want to go and they want to cover for their negligence to some extent sometimes as well, right?
Yeah.
And I talk about this in the blog I wrote a little bit, but I think sometimes people demonize landlords a lot. And reality is that like most landlords are just normal people. And most of the time, like a lot of the pain people are experiencing with rentals is, the real estate. And again, I'm making some assumptions here, but a real estate agent, like many professionals, is going to use the landlord as a buffer, or like the idea of the landlord as a buffer sometimes. Like if they're talking to the tenant, they're going to be like, oh, I don't know if the landlord will be happy with this, because that's much easier than saying, I don't know if I'll be happy with this. People do that all the time. So yeah, really tricky. But yeah, the short story is like, fight for your bond. If you're a good actor, there's lots of bad tenants out there. There's tenants who don't pay their rent. There's tenants who completely destroy the place far more than the bond. But if you've been a good tenant and you feel like you're getting extorted, then there's a very good chance that there's not going to be any case that these people are ever going to follow up with. So I would just, stick to it. In my last rental, the light bulbs started blowing, Dave, just randomly. Like I think there was like 9 in the house, and over the course of about 2 months, they all blew,
Wow.
And I replaced like 5 of them and they kept blowing. And I emailed the real estate and I was like, I think there's an electrical problem with the house, and they just ignored that email. And then when I moved out, if they were to email me and be like, hey, you can't just move out and leave all the bulbs broken. Bulbs are the responsibility of the tenant. We're going to have to get the bulbs replaced. Be like, try me,
Yeah. Yeah.
If you really want to. Yeah, I'd love to turn up to an NCAT tribunal and show them the email where I told them that 14 bulbs have exploded, And some people get very like, oh, I don't really want to leave the next tenant in that situation, which I get because, we're all very sympathetic people if there's like a problem like that. But I try and take a bit more of a view on this, which is like, if all you do is over focus on the next tenant's experience, all you're really doing is validating the like real estate's behavior, because if you're like, oh, I don't want to screw the next tenant over, it's like, well, yeah, then the real estate knows they can keep screwing other people over, and that becomes like an ongoing problem.
But very quickly, if you were in that situation and you turned up and your new rental had 6 blown globes, very quickly you would just complain to the agent, and the agent would tell the owner. The owner's like, yeah, okay, let's just get it fixed. Like, you can't just have like no lights in the house effectively.
Yeah, exactly. Like
that's
you're 100% right. Like it's not like the next tenant's out of in a predicament anyway, because they have the right to have that resolved.
Yeah. So if we speak a bit more about the actual process of being in the property, what have you learnt about things like rental inspections and maybe leases and things like that as well?
Yeah, there's lots of things to unpack here. I think in terms of rental inspections, when it comes to like there's if you read the tenancy agreements, there's usually large chunks of the tenancy agreement that basically stipulate limitations on certain things in terms of like these are the only times in which a landlord or real estate is allowed to come into the property, or this is how often they're able to visit, for an inspection, or this is how much notice they have to give for an inspection, or if they're trying to sell the place, this is how often, inspections are able to happen. And it's really worth just reading that. If you don't have to read it preemptively, but if you ever kind of feel like a real estate's butting up against you, you can read that. I've had some friends once who they were living in an apartment and the real estate was trying to sell the apartment that they were renting to another owner. And the real estate was trying to get like 4 inspections in a week. And I said to these people, I was like, you can just read the agreement, like the tenancy agreement. It says really clearly you kind of can't do that. Like there's a reason in New South Wales, for instance, that if you go to buy a property, particularly one that is tenanted, there's typically only 2 inspections a week. It's like all tied into the tenancy law to some extent as well. So I think there's tons of stuff like that around them visiting for inspections or, again, selling the property that are worth reading. They're the smaller things.
Because then because the idea behind that is it interferes with your enjoyment of the home that you're paying for the entirety of the lease. Because just for the reason that it's the end of the lease or there's a month to go doesn't mean they all of a sudden are entitled to like visit more often. So quite often it's like a give and take sort of situation where, like, a lot of times I've been a landlord and I've been selling the property and I've wanted to have access to the property so that I'll have the manager go to them and be like, okay, you basically request it. You don't demand like we need 3 or 4 inspections this week, please. No, you request it and they have to be, very reasonable about it. And then you offer them like, you can have the last 2 weeks of the tenancy free. Like you don't have to pay rent for those 2 weeks if you're willing to be flexible on these sorts of things. So yeah, but basically they can't interfere with your enjoyment of the property. That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, my advice with this stuff is like, don't go and jump to the tenancy agreement unless you have a problem. Like if a real estate emailed me and was like, we want to show someone the property next Tuesday. And I was like, yeah, seems fine. I wouldn't go and, cause an argument about it. It's only if I was starting to kind of feel a little bit like, oh, this is becoming a lot now. And I'm feeling a little bit, overwhelmed by this whole thing, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. We actually had in our last rental that we were in, I think one day I was on the podcast. So I was in the house and I was busy. And I noticed out the window, the owner that we had met previously, like rocked up and they were like walking around in the yard. And I'm like, what? What are they doing? And then so later that day I emailed the agent. I'm like, man, this isn't cool. Like they can't just come in and walk around the property, like whether we're home or not. Like that's just not cool.
100%. No, exactly. And it's like, it's all written in the tenancy agreement, which is why it's always worth really reading that. I think one of the most interesting parts of the tenancy agreement, Dave, is the stuff on urgent repairs. Because there's like really, when something's wrong with your rental, I would say things basically fall into like urgent or not urgent problems, right? So like, let's say you try and shut a door in your house or apartment and the door kind of is a little, little stiff, or it rattles a little bit when it's shut, it's not quite, that's like not an urgent repair. And that falls into this bucket of just like frustrating things where you'll email the real estate. Most of the time they'll just ignore you. Sometimes they'll say, we'll get around to it. In real estate, it's not like they don't see your email. Like a lot of them would just be like, damn, maybe this will just go away, or if I don't have to deal with this.
It just goes in the not important bucket, like long-term maintenance to consider for the landlord.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't want to bug the landlord, right? Because like the number of times like a real estate agent, and you got to understand from a real estate agent's perspective, a landlord wants the real estate agent to disappear,
To be
like
left
they just
alone.
want the rent to come in. Yeah, so they don't want to get emails and questions and pestering. And even if it's the tenant that's the problem, it's going to feel like the real estate could be doing better or something like this, sometimes, I'm sure. So the real estates, they might ignore your problems. But when it comes to urgent repairs, these things have really clear
stipulations on when they need to be fixed by, things like that.
Yeah, so urgent repairs are basically pretty obvious stuff. It's like, does your hot water not work? Is there a water leak? Is there any electrical faults? A power point's not working? Is like fundamental heating not working? Like these things that would like really affect your comfort or like intensely affect your comfort or safety broadly. And these are listed out like in the tenancy agreements and on government websites. So you don't need to kind of generalize that too far. But if these things go wrong, you basically are allowed to expect the real estate to solve these problems imminently. like within, call it like 1 to 3 days or whatever is reasonable there. And if they're not solved, you're actually allowed to go and spend money of it in New South Wales and get that money reimbursed. So let's say it's, Saturday morning and for some reason, the stove, you're clicking it, but nothing's coming out. You're allowed to call an electrician or a plumber to have a look at it to get that fixed and get that reimbursed if the real estate's not being helpful. And I kind of cover this in the video I made on a channel, which we'll link in the description in the show notes. But it's like I think the process is really simple. Something goes wrong, you email the real estate. I always try and call the real estate after I've emailed them. You say, this has happened, can we get this fixed? I generally will expect a real estate to reply with a solution within 24 to 48 hours. And then from that point, for them to provide a solution within 24 to 48 hours. Some people might think that's too, generous. They don't really define what that is in the tenancy agreements. They just say what's reasonable. That's my definition of reasonable, because I think that pretty adequately covers what I'd consider a disaster situation, which is like a Friday night issue. And to give an example, Dave, I once had my hot water in the middle of winter break on Friday night at 9 p.m. And I'm sympathetic to the landlord to some extent that, weekend call outs can be really expensive for tradespeople, So I was like, sure, if we can get this sorted on the first thing on Monday, that's fine. So going like 2.5 days in the middle of winter with no hot water is pretty brutal. But I feel like, while someone might be like, I expect it sorted out by Saturday night or Sunday, I'm kind of like, yeah, I can probably survive 24 hours to save like a stranger $400 or $500. Like no one, you got to on the other side of that, right? Like no one wants to get a call and be like, you got to spend an extra like week's worth of rent of income just to like do the weekend call out fee or something like this. If it's, but everyone's different.
To make Hayden warm for an extra day.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's different. Some people would think that like even pressing it is unreasonable. Some people would think like waiting 2.5 days for it's kind of crazy, but that's where I kind of come from. Is I think the longest anyone should wait for these like urgent issues that particularly aren't a safety issue is like Friday night incident solved by Monday lunchtime kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. They definitely can't be like shopping around for quotes for 2 weeks to try and get a new hot water system. That's just not cool, right? You can't do that.
Yeah, and that's what happened to me with the hot water actually, was that they kept pushing it out till Monday, and then someone came on Monday and looked at it, and then they called the real estate and they gave them the quote, and the real estate said, we're not happy with the quote, so we're going to get someone else to come in on Wednesday. And I was like, no. Like we're not playing these games, And just be wary. Like I've been in a lot of phone arguments with real estate agents before. Like they will say stuff that's not true all the time, and they'll call your bluff. Like I think I quote unquote said to this real estate, something along the lines of, this needs to be fixed today. And if it's not fixed, I'm going to get it paid for and I'm going to get it reimbursed. And the real estate was like, you can do what you want, but we're never effing reimbursing you for this.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not every real estate. Typically, I won't lie. I do find the smaller real estates are usually a bit more of a nuisance with this stuff. Like the really independent ones or they're kind of like not the LJ Hookers of the world. I think it's just the brand. I think probably scares people a little bit into like not saying something completely ludicrous, but that's a broad generalization. I've only ever had like 5 real estates I've worked with. But yeah, they said that on the phone and it's like they'll just say stuff that's untrue or unlawful and you just have to look past it sometimes.
All right, so if we move on to things like leases and people, weighing up fixed and periodic sort of tenancies and what you've learned around that sort of angle of renting, and connected to that, I guess, is the idea of possibly negotiating on your rent and things like that, or lease terms perhaps.
Yeah, so, New South Wales, again, you basically have your fixed term leases, which are like typically 12 months, sometimes 6 months. And they basically say, this lease will go from today, February 28th, till next year, February 28th. And basically the real estate has to tell you 3 months before the end of that if they don't want you to stay, and you only have to tell them 2 weeks before the end of that. And then there's the other one, which is a periodic lease, which some people call month by month or ongoing, but it basically means like, well, they say month by month, but it's not really month by month. It's like there is no fixed term. You're basically living there and anyone can call it quits at any time. It's just there's different notice periods. So for instance, in terms of the notice periods, if you're in that kind of like ongoing, no fixed term, the tenant has to give 3 weeks notice and the real estate has to give 90 days notice, which is basically, 12 weeks notice. My general advice with this stuff is if you really like where you're living and you're not interested in ever shopping around, then I think fixed terms are great. because like they obviously give you security. But if you kind of think you're going to be wanting to move sometime in the next 12 months, or you don't really like the place, or maybe you don't like the landlord or real estate for some reason, periodic leases are great. Some people think they don't provide a lot of security, which is fair. But what I'd say is like 90 days is a long time. You know, like when you get given notice, 90 days is a huge amount of time. You know, when I'm on periodic leases, I don't think of it as like a housing security problem. I think of it as like a lot of an admin problem, or like, what if I'm going away, or what if I'm going to, you know, see family for a month or something like that? You don't want to kind of get a notice randomly. But, you know, I've generally leaned towards periodic leases the second anything started to go wrong with a rental, or I've started to get sus on the real estate, or I don't think I want to live in this area long term, because it just kind of gives me an easier out. Because the good thing is, like, as a tenant, when you can give 3 weeks notice anytime, you could just kind of in June or July start looking for another rental. And if you find one, probably just kind of sign it and deal with, you know, a tiny bit of overlap or something like that. So I think it just gives you a lot more control if you can kind of handle the slight reduction in security that comes from it. And one of the main reasons I've gotten on periodic leases has been rent increases. I think a lot of real estates I've seen will try and tie in a rent increase, which they're allowed to do every so often. They'll tie it into the re-signing of the lease just because it's administratively convenient. And a bunch of times I've gone onto periodic have basically been when a real estate said, we're raising the rent by this much. Can you re-sign the lease? And I've basically gone back and said, acknowledged about the rent going up, but I would not like to re-sign a fixed term lease. I'd like it to be periodic, or like carry on as periodic. And my experience with real estates has been, they obviously want some more security from you. But if you're going to agree to the rent increase, and or if there's no rent increase and you're just not a bad tenant, they're probably just going to keep you, because like you moving out then sucks because they'll have to find someone. But if you're on periodic, all that means is they have you longer, more stability longer, and it just defers the same problem. So it's not like they'd ever, I've never seen a real estate be like, oh, you know, oh, you don't want to do a fixed term, then get out. Like, I'm sure there's some cases, particularly like, say, if for some reason people really want reliable income, but I've never heard of it in my fairly small sphere.
It would be mostly in the case of a new tenant signing up and saying they want a periodic lease. That's going to be super unattractive to a landlord, and probably pretty rare unless the tenant was trying to buy a house within 3 months or something like that. Because the hesitation for the landlord is, well, as soon as they move out, I've got to pay leasing fees, which is going to be another like 2 or 3 weeks rent gone just there to try and get a new tenant after that. So if you're already in there, like you said, Hayden, it's not really a problem if you just stay a few months longer, which is quite common. I've had that happen multiple times with tenants over the years, and I don't mind if they stay a bit longer, that's fine. But yeah, because you're going to have to pay that leasing fee anyway because they plan to move out. So it's just going to be a bit delayed, which is perfectly fine.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no harm in asking for that. There's also no harm in like trying to ask about rent increases or renegotiate rent increases. Like, I think I was in a rental where it was at $450 and they tried to raise it to $520, and I basically wrote an email with some babble of an excuse asking, you know, saying that if it's anything higher than $510, I'll probably be looking to move out. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You know, all I'd say is like, I don't know a scenario in which a real estate takes offense to you trying to like scab $10 a week.
Yeah, that ain't
and goes like, get out. You know, they would just go back to the landlord and be like, is this okay? And the landlord will be like, oh, fine, or no. You know, it sounds a little bit exploity. I probably wouldn't recommend you do that just on like every time. Like, it's not like every time a real estate's email me with a rental increase, I've been like 10% less, please. It's more, I think, if it feels over the top. I'm sure a lot of people have seen like a rental increase where, you know, rent goes from say 400 to 600 in 1 year, and it feels like it's outpacing the market or inflation or CPI or all kinds of stuff, and it just feels a little bit like maybe too big a reasonable jump.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had like someone go, we're increasing the rent from $370 a week to like $410, and me be like, I don't know about that. Let's do 405.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think most tenants and most landlords would probably be pretty reasonable about this sort of thing. Again, I've had this experience with tenants over the years where there'll be a rent increase suggested by the real estate agent based on what the market level of rent is, and I'll try and go below that just so that it's more comfortable for the tenant, but then also reduces my risk that they think that they can get something cheaper elsewhere, right? So it's making it attractive for them to stay. So that gives I suppose they get security and then I get security and I don't have to pay the big leasing fees because obviously that's pretty unappealing. So most landlords are going to do the math and be like, well, if this person moves out, if I try and rent it for too much to them, then I might have vacancy for 1 or 2 weeks and then I'm going to have to pay leasing fees for the new tenant. So I could potentially be out of pocket 3 or 4 weeks rent, which is again could be $1,500, $2,000. So they're going to need to get like an extra $30 a week, $40 a week just to break even on that decision. So it doesn't even make financial sense for them to do so. So if you're pretty reasonable about your, where you're sitting on that rent increase and what you're trying to negotiate, then 9 times out of 10, the landlord's going to be like, yeah, okay, like I can see why that's fair. And that's also, better for me as well. So definitely keep that in mind.
Yeah, 100%. I think that makes a huge amount of sense. And always remember that if you're a good tenant, no one really wants you to leave as a general rule. Like the real estate, the landlord, they just want to keep the money flowing. And the only reasons they're going to kick you out are because if you're a good tenant, are basically because they want to move into the place or because someone else will pay more if you won't pay more, at the end of the day. So
there probably is some sort of a kooky or crazy landlord out there who has their ego somewhat tied to the amount of rent they can get for a property. So I'm not trying to say that everyone's going to be flexible on this. Some people
you never know. That's the thing.
Well,
right?
It's worth $800 a week, so I'm not taking a penny less. There's definitely going to be people like that out there,
Yeah, well, that's what I mean with like when you kind of counter suggest a slightly lower rent, there is always a theoretical chance that you just piss someone off. Like there's definitely going to be someone or a few people out there that will just by the suggestion alone and the big energy just be like, get rid of them. And the real estate's not going to like be like, oh, I refuse. That's unreasonable. The real estate's they'll probably be like, relax, like it's okay. But if you really said to the real estate, get rid of them, the real estate's going to be like, aye, boss, you pay the bills, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's right. Yeah.
So,
but I mean, the worst case scenario is you ask for the rent reduction and they say no. And then you basically just be like, okay, well, I'll pay it then.
Yeah, that's
otherwise
fine.
You're like, seems kind of excessive. Let me find something else. And obviously you don't want to move, but if you're not able to make a kind of a reasonable middle ground situation with the agent and landlord, then I guess that's the best course of action.
Yeah. The other thing too is you can always use a fixed lease as a bit of a carrot if you'd like to as well. So let's say rent goes up from $450 to $550. You can say, I'm probably not comfortable signing another fixed term lease or renewing my fixed term lease at $550. I'd happily go to periodic at $550, but if we want to do another fixed term, can we do $530? And that can kind of just pose, like you're just trying to pose like balances of stuff where someone might sit around being like, oh, well, at least this way for the next 12 months, I know that they're going to stick there or have to pay lease breaking fees or something.
That's a good point. I think you could also do it the other way as well. So depending on the market that you're in, you could also offer the security of an 18-month lease to the landlord. If they're suggesting, okay, let's move the rent from $500 to $550 or whatever, for 12 months, you could say, okay, I'll pay that rent, but I want an 18-month lease with no rent increase after 12 months. And if they're looking for security, they might be like, okay, well, I've got a decent rent increase there, but then that's kind of locked in for 18 months. So if it's not an insane market, then the landlord is more likely to consider something like that as well. And especially it's going to line up if you also want that certainty over your time frame in the property.
Another one that's actually worked well for me in the past, Dave, you just reminded me of it, is if you really want a property or you want to kind of appear to be doing things in good favor, I've just paid rent in advance. Like I paid like 3 weeks ahead.
Yeah, that works.
And some people love cash. And the benefit of this is like tenants are so protected by the law that like paying your rent in advance pretty much exposes you like in no way really, because what would you call it? The notice periods to leave are so big anyway. Like, let's say your notice period is 3 weeks on a periodic lease. You can just pay 3 weeks ahead in the rent. And then like you can give notice and pay no more rent and just live the 3 weeks in the buffer. Like there's just no like, you're not exposed with it, which I think is really important. This is also another tip for people who are doing like subletting, not through fair trading, not through like an official lease. Like if you ever go to like rent out a room with someone, keep as much as you can in writing. And if they're like, oh, can I have a bond a cash bond to this BSB and account number, which is a giant red flag. I would always avoid that. Usually what I've done in that situation is like, I don't feel comfortable giving you 2 weeks of bond, but if you want, I can just pay you 3 weeks of rent in advance. So we're like always 3 weeks ahead. And the thing is that often gives people the impression of security, which is really good. But the useful part is particularly if you've gotten this written down somewhere, even if it's not an official tenancy through a real estate, you're a lot more protected with evidence that you've been paying rent in advance, because then you're entitled to the place. Whereas the second you send just like a stranger money to their BSB and account number as bond, no one's really going to be able to look at that and protect your money if they just decide to not give it back to you, if that makes sense. One random one, Dave, that I wanted to chat about is, and this one I think means a lot to me, is like a kid who kind of spent my teenage years in a single parent household that was like struggling to find rentals, is if there's a concern that you think real estates are going to be prejudicial about, which they are prejudicial a lot of the time, you can raise that concern pretty late in the process. The reason I have to be really tricky giving this advice is because it can border on extortion if you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You know, and I'll give you a really simple example. It's like, let's say you have a pet bunny rabbit, right? Or something like this, something really cute and pretty contained. Like, let's say you had to disclose this for some reason. I don't know if you have to. I've never had a bunny rabbit, but let's say you did. It's like, I would wait until the day I'm signing the lease to bring that up. And I just like, as I turn up to the real estate office, I'd be like, oh, by the way, I have a bunny rabbit. I'm just going to write this in here. And the thing is, that's going to annoy them. But let's be real. Like, you having a bunny rabbit in the house is not going to like cause any grief. Or if you're a good person, if it causes grief, you're going to fix it. You know, like let's say, you know, it stains the carpet. You're going to fix the carpet. Like I'm assuming you're a good person here. But the problem is, if you're in a market where there's like 10 people looking for a property and you email the real estate and saying, is it okay if I ever get straight? They're just like straight away going to be like, they're like, too much work. I have like 8 people here who are like willing to move in. Or, you know, I've turned up to places where like the toilet has like clearly got something wrong with it and it's smelly. And I've emailed the real estate and I've been like, will the toilet get fixed, by the way? And then the next day the lease is like signed by someone else. It's taken off domain, you know? So if it's something where like you think you feel like you're a good person, you feel like you're asking for reasonable stuff or not too much, you feel like you're up against prejudice, but you still have to kind of sort it out, do it late. So that toilet example, I would turn up on the day of signing the lease and I would be like, can I just get in writing before I sign this that that's going to get solved? And the real estate will be like, oh, I can't do that. I can't just sign. I'll be like, I don't need to sign the lease today then. And like, they 100% do not want that to happen.
Yeah.
They like, when you're there and you're signing the lease, they've got 10 other things to do today. They don't want to call the landlord and then be like relisted and call other things and get it in. And then it's like, it's just, you know, and I'm trying not to sound like, because don't be a bad person with this, but it's like, if it's something that's bad, you know, like the electrical outlet was buzzing and that's a bad example because it's an urgent repair, so you can get that fixed anyway. It's like, feel free to just not bring it up early because you will just get prejudiced straight out of it if they don't need to. And we can pretend like the world's really fair and stuff, but I'm sure a lot of real estate agents would just exclude people easily. When I did my first rental, Dave, it was me and 3 other dudes who didn't drink. We were like the most boring people. And we turned up to every real estate inspection in suits because we were just like...
in suits.
We were like, if we're 4 20-year-old guys who are turning up to like these houses and there's like just a young couple, you know, without kids, we're screwed.
Yeah,
because like, true. you know, anti-discrimination, prejudice, whatever, they're going to do it. They're going to look at that and be like,
Because just by nature of there being more people in the house, you're like, well, that's more wear and tear on the carpets and on everything, right?
Yeah, it's hard, you know, like, you know, people that turn up to rental inspections with kids, you know, like I feel bad for them sometimes. If I go to a rental inspection without kids, like I've seen it happen, is they'll just be like, well, kids make a mess, kids damage the walls, you know, can be really tricky.
What I'm getting from you, mate, is that you should go to a rental inspection and apply as a single, and then just after you've signed the lease, or maybe just before, or when you're doing it, you're like, oh, by the way, I have a wife and 3 kids and 2 dogs, so they'll be joining me very shortly in the home.
Yeah, I mean, you might need to mention I don't know. I've never had the kids problem, but I feel like if I had kids and I was trying to rent, I didn't have a lot of money just to like splash at the rental price, I would try not to like mention the 3 kids part as late as possible.
Borderline fraudulent, mate, when you're doing the application. You have to put it on the application though.
Oh, there you go. We can't do that then. I've never had to fill out the kids part of an application, Dave. Yeah, no.
Oh, I
Yeah,
forgot.
don't do that.
Sorry, I forgot. I just remembered.
Remember, guys, don't lie. That's like the don't lie about your identity or your situation, because that becomes criminal very
He's
quickly.
just saying withhold the truth until the last minute. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, if it's a bunny rabbit, or if it's like, if the toilet's broken and they didn't make a clear indicator that they're going to get it fixed.
Yeah, definitely things like repairs, because almost definitely things like that will be fixed. So if you can wait until after you've moved in and be like, hey, this isn't working, or hey, blah, 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 then the owner's going to be like, oh, well, we just got a tenant, like just fix it and let's just like get on with it, right? But if you do it at the start, but no one else has mentioned any problems, then like you said, Hayden, someone else's who seems like a simpler, easier applicant is more likely to get it because they haven't really started complaining yet.
Yeah, and it's something that's just very personal to me, because I had a single mum, and we had a dog since 2008, and I watched her, with fairly limited income, struggle to get a rental because you could kind of tell they heard the dog question and were like, no, I don't know. And it was a small indoor dog. And, the thing that annoyed me about it was and I kept saying to her, I was like, stop telling him about the fucking dog. Just stop talking about it, because the dog makes no mess. Like, I lived with the dog myself for several years. And not only that, but if the dog did make a mess, my mum has a conscience and she would fix the problem.
But you would have to anyway, right? Because it's
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the part that I never understood about, like not allowing pets. Like technically, a lot of times now you are.
Yeah. From a landlord's perspective, you're like, of course they're going to hate dogs, because a dog versus not a dog means higher risk of drama. That makes sense in a general way. It makes sense why landlords are prejudicial. A lot of people might say it's mean, but a lot of people would probably do that too. But then it's like, if you're you and and you're a person who would fix something wrong that you created, don't expose yourself to the prejudice, is my point, But I just have to be careful, because I know I say that advice, and there's people out there with, I guess, less good consciences who are just like, yeah, or they don't understand the nuance of that. They just start doing fraudulent things, or they, do illegal stuff. Don't do that. It's just, protect yourself if you really have to. There's a lot of people battling out there is the point. So, without being immoral or without being illegal, don't feel compelled to play the games and screw yourself over.
All right, so what about when it comes to like moving house and things like that? Have you found any tips, mate, for that sort of thing?
Yeah, probably two quick ones. One is, when I'm looking for new places, generally over the years, I've always just gone to domain or realestate.com.au, and I've filtered by my filters, and then I've just picked the areas that are close to where I live that have as many dots as possible. I've found it pretty reliable that the best thing you can do to make renting easier is rent in high supply areas. There'll be less people at inspections. There'll be less kind of crazy, rent bidding wars and things like that. Some people don't want to do it because they don't want to live there. The reason I live in the suburb I'm in originally is because I rented here, and I rented here because the suburb is like fraught with 8 to 12 apartment unit buildings, like everywhere. So rentals were just amazingly easy to find in the area. The other thing is, when you do eventually move, one thing I found really useful is you can hire lots of vans and trucks and stuff from local petrol stations, like online from GoGet. I can often get like a van or a truck for like 24 hours for around about $100. And Bunnings lets you rent out these things called stair trolleys, I think for like $20 or something like that. I can't remember the exact, $20 for 24 hours, which are basically trolleys you can go take up and down stairs. I've moved tons of times for a moving cost of $120, moving like fridges, beds, desks up and down 3 or 4 flights of stairs sometimes. I've always managed to move everything in one day. It's my like rule. I'm just like, it's all going today. Maybe it wasn't all unpacked in a day, but I did the heavy lifting in a day. I think moving, obviously if you're able-bodied, doesn't have to be expensive, but obviously if you're not able-bodied or you don't have the time, it becomes a lot more challenging. But if you are able-bodied and you do have the time and you want to save some money, you can do that instead of, paying removalists to sort it all out.
Yeah, I think those are some interesting tips. I suppose what you're pointing out is the density of the area that you live in is going to mean more supply if there's apartment towers and lots of construction and things like that. It could also happen, I suppose, further away from the city with more like house and land package type things. You can often get into like an oversupply situation with those. So that's going to be more of a drag on rents. And so rents in those areas are going to probably grow a bit slower than they would elsewhere where there's not much building or anything happening. So I think that's good advice. But I guess the pushback there is people are not going to want to live in apartments a lot of times, right? So that's the compromise, because there's rarely an oversupply of like houses themselves in a lot of suburbs unless you go further out, like I said, with the house and land packages. So I suppose that's the concern there.
Yeah, everyone will always be trying to live in the best place they can, and it's very rare people move into the place they had at the top of their list.
Yeah. And as for the moving thing, I think that's good advice, man. I've never done that myself, so I couldn't really be bothered with that. But like, it didn't even cost that much the last 2 times we moved. It was like $500 or something, right? So, but it's going to depend on how much stuff you have. So I've seen people quote like, oh, it costs $2,500 to move. I'm like, how much shit do you have? Like, that's got to be an insane level of stuff, right? Or is it just they got overcharged, or what's going on there? Or they moved a very long distance perhaps, but I've seen that mentioned multiple times and I'm like, what's going on?
Yeah, I always just think, as long as you're looking after your back and you're not hurting yourself, like I could be a lot fitter than I am. So I don't mind spending a day lifting everything.
Yeah, that's fair. If you can do it, probably worth considering if you're looking to save a bit of cash.
Yeah. Or if not, removalists are probably a bunch of people who are trying to make money doing the same thing anyway. So just
exactly. Yeah. Side hustle, mate.
Yeah.
Hayden's removals coming soon.
It was good, Dave, though. Thank you for trying to unpack all of those different things. Hopefully people have found it interesting. I think, this has obviously just been my experience, and everyone's, unique lived experiences vary. So if you do have something that you think is incompatible with what you've seen, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you have any other tips, we'd also love to hear about it in the comments. So just email us and we can share it on a future episode.
Yeah, sounds good. So hopefully you got something out of today's episode and you found it interesting, guys. If you've got a case study, as always, you can email that to us, or you can find the link in the show notes for that, or you can reach out to us on socials. So you can contact Perla to get a hold of Hayden or myself at Strong Money Australia. And for topic suggestions and things like that, you can always reach out at hello@aussiefirepod.com. But that's it for this one, guys. So we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Aussie Fire. For more FI inspiration, head to perla.com to browse our resources, calculators, and community insights. Perla is an authorized representative, number 1281540, of Sandland Private Wealth Pty Ltd, with AFSL number 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when investing. So always seek advice and/or check out the relevant disclosure document for any financial product, including the PDS and TMD before deciding. These are available from the product issuer's website. When you invest, your capital is at risk, and past performance is not a reliable indicator of future investment returns.